All right, this is Block 5, the Roaring Twenties, Part 4, Responses to Racism, with this section beginning with Booker T. Washington, Accommodationist. The racism of American society in the early 20th century created a big problem for American blacks. And what we're going to talk about in this section is how black Americans responded to that racism in trying to improve their lives and make their lives as tolerable as possible and as equal as possible in a society that, quite frankly, did not want them. And if this society could have snapped its fingers, it would have had all the black people in America disappear, and most of them would have been perfectly happy to see that. The first person that we're going to look at is an American by the name of Booker T. Washington. Washington was born a slave in the South. And his beliefs are known as accommodationist, and we're going to see why. That I want you guys to be able to differentiate between these three separate responses. The first is accommodation, and that was exemplified by Booker T. Washington, a great American in his own right. Washington was one of those stories that you read his biography and you're like, wow. He was born a slave, born illiterate, or not born, not everyone's born illiterate, but he was illiterate as a young man, and spent money to go to school and learn how to read to the detriment of having a place to live. He chose to be homeless and go to school rather than have a roof over his head and be uneducated. And it's quite a story. I don't know why George Washington covered also showed up. Previous. Let's stay here on Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington, rising from these humble origins, believed that the key to blacks getting respect in America would come after they had a degree of economic success. Booker T. Washington pretty much said, look, America is racist, and it's not getting better anytime soon. The only way to make it better is to force white America to see black America as productive, happy citizens. And if that means putting off political equality for the time being, then we're going to put it off. Booker T. Washington accepted segregation. He accepted Jim Crow. And he said to his mostly black audiences, look, we can't do anything about this right now. What we have to do first is make ourselves better, and eventually white America will come around to seeing us as equals. But while there's so much black poverty, and while there's so much black illiteracy, white America is never going to take us seriously enough to give us equal rights in the political and economic arenas. So what Booker T. Washington fought to do was he fought for black education and fought for black economic self-sufficiency. And to do this, he worked to create, black-owned banks that would lend money to black, business owners and farmers. And most famously, he opened up a school called the Tuskegee Institute. And the Tuskegee Institute was a place where blacks could go for higher education and learn advanced farming techniques. It was mostly an agricultural institute, teaching good farming techniques and how to be a better farmer to grow into the American middle class. How to read and write, be educated, pass those things down on to the next generation. The most famous of the professors at Tuskegee was an American by the name of George Washington Carver. And George Washington Carver was also born a slave and worked for decades at the Tuskegee Institute, coming up with new and different uses for southern products that black farmers could grow. Peanuts most famously. He invented dozens of uses for the peanut, and now black farmers in his classes, under his advice, with his tutelage, could now take peanuts and turn them into economically viable products. White America loved Booker T. Washington, really. He was the most famous black person in white America's eyes because he was not a radical. He did not argue for full political equality. He argued for the very American qualities of self-sufficiency, economic opportunity, and all the things that Americans believe about themselves. Black radicals, on the other hand, did not necessarily like Booker T. Washington because he was not willing to fight for immediate full civil and political and economic rights. But the fact does remain that in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s, while Jim Crow is still in the South, that the poverty level for American blacks consistently fell. The literacy rate for American blacks in the segregated South consistently rose. And black communities in the South, not for the first time, but on a large scale, began not to be just dirt poor tenant farmers for the first time really since the Civil War. There is still Jim Crow, there is still legal segregation, but economic self-sufficiency leads to self-esteem and leads to the ability in the future to argue for fuller political and civil rights. So that's Booker T. Washington's his accommodationist philosophy.